Hello and welcome to the Surgical Spirit podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Haidar Al-hakim, the Third Eye Doctor. Pull up a chair and get ready for some candid and uncompromising discussion with experts, innovators, agitators, and influential people from every corner of health and well-being. From inside the hospital to at home in the kitchen, we're leaving no stone unturned in our quest to uncover the secrets of healthier, happier, more successful, and less stressful lives. Thank you so much for joining us, and without further ado, let's meet this episode's guest. Hi, Claire. How are you today?
Oh, very well, thank you.
Thanks for coming on the podcast. I used to get nerves about having really famous guests on the podcast, but I don't have that anymore, because I realized that, we're all the same, really.
We're all the same. If you prick us, we will bleed. We're all just exactly the same. And I don't think of myself in any way as high profile, though increasingly I find myself in the public domain, and what I say is taken so seriously that I have to be very careful now.
And I follow you on Twitter, and some of the comments are taken so out of context, and are quite vitriolic, really, and
yeah,
I don't know why that happens.
Well, I've got theories around. I mean, Twitter, number one, is a place that de facto is easy to be misunderstood and to misunderstand. So it's a very strange forum. It gives you the illusion of being together, of closeness, yet actually it's not. It's not a space where you can share important issues, where you can be nuanced, where you can even be sarcastic. You have to be absolutely down the line on every single word. So it's a place that itself is difficult to negotiate. And then I think there are issues in particular, I have to say it around me, that people seem to pigeonhole me into a space and they know nothing about me, yet they make comments about me. And I often wonder why they do that on the basis of an avatar and a few words as talking about your profile. And then Twitter and social media also exposes some really nasty comments. People make these comments sometimes in the dead of night, maybe after a bit of alcohol, and think there's no repercussions for it. Well, there are repercussions. It's deeply hurtful, and in a way more so than if people speak bad things to you, because at least you can come back to them if they talk to you. But on social media, it's impossible.
Yeah, and I guess it's good that the regulatory bodies are having more of a say into this, and there are guidelines to this, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, but when I was chair of the Royal College of GPs, there was a whole move to restrict doctors' use of social media, and I said, well, that's ridiculous. It's like restricting the use of a pen. You can put guidance and around what you write, but you can't about the use of a pen. And I think it's really about people understanding that there is a human being behind the tweet. There is a human being when you write nasty things about somebody. It's not just into the ether and then disappears. It's deeply hurtful. So I personally now, I'm restricting my use of social media. I very rarely now look at Twitter. I did for quite a while get a sort of post-traumatic stress disorder type symptoms. I got anxious even to see the icon of the Twitter icon. So, but I won't be frightened away from it. But I am much more cautious now about using it, because it brings out the worst in people, I think, as well as the best. But it's not a space to make to make nuanced comments. It's a space maybe to give information or just to make some sort of comment, but not nuanced ones.
Yeah, it's very difficult, and I personally don't post anything on Twitter because, first of all, I'm very sarcastic, and I say some weird things all the time, and it doesn't make sense for a lot of people. But yeah, very reluctant to write anything on Twitter whatsoever. I just put pictures on because I enjoy putting pictures on, and I always have that kind of slight positive slant to things.
Well, that's what I find. That's what I find that I find, to be absolutely honest, please don't take this the wrong way, but I find that really boring. I find it really boring when people tweet, oh, today I saw the sunshine and I went to a lovely meeting and saw some lovely people. I think, well, yep, but if you try to do the opposite and be slightly provocative, I've twice had a Twitter storm, once very early on when I was on social media, and more recently, and it is not easy to live through a Twitter storm, and I will not now risk my mental health by doing it. But equally, I can't just be somebody that posts, today the sun is shining and I took my dog for a walk. It's meaningless. What I'd like to do is the debate about, why does this happen? Is there some sort of gender aspect to it? Are people less tolerant of women and powerful women? Why are people envious of particular women? Why do people misinterpret what the issue? If you put in, so I'd far rather have a debate, but it's impossible. It is absolutely impossible now. Even if I did put, today is Wednesday, somebody would come back and say, how dare you? It's Thursday in Australia, and you've missed out the whole of the rest of the world, etc., etc.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, for me, I know psychologically speaking, it would go down if I went down that particular nuance and opinionated piece. But yeah, I'm definitely boring on Twitter. I find that things like LinkedIn is much better, because you have that sort of capacity to write whatever you want and make it as nuanced as possible. But I think Twitter is a no-go area, really.
It's no-go, and for me, I'm picked up by the mainstream press, who then use what I say to run pieces, and again, it's not worth my psychological health to have to worry about it too much now.
Have you got thicker skin?
No, of course I haven't. I often think about what people. I mean, you're a psychotherapist as well as a surgeon, an ophthalmologist, but there's no such thing, unless you're a psychopath, of having thick skin.
Right.
All you do is learn how to deal with pain, and the way I deal with it is knowing that time will heal. So it's not that it makes it less painful. You just understand that not to catastrophize, that it will heal. It's only a few people, blah, blah, blah. So unless you truly are psychopathic, and I'm not psychopathic, of course it hurts. And I suspect it hurts me just as much as it hurts other people. It's just that you have to deal with it because you've got to continue with your profile and continue with life.
And how do you deal with it these days? Because the onslaught is continuous, really.
It's continuous, hence the fact that I did take myself off and then put myself back on again. But now, as I said, you also have to realize what's important. Twitter debates are not important. If you take yourself off social media, any social media, the world doesn't come to an end. Your life doesn't come to an end. So I think it's about getting priorities right. And at this moment in time, my priorities are supporting the Royal College of GPs as the president, making sure that my profession, general practitioners, feel that I'm behind them. I understand the pains that they're going through in terms of workload, and supporting other doctors in the work that I do with practitioner health.
Well, you've got very broad shoulders.
Yes, 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 and yes, I have got broad shoulders, but equally, I carry a lot of responsibility with those shoulders.
Where has that come from?
What, the carrying a lot of responsibility?
Yeah.
Or the broad shoulders?
Well, both, yeah.
Well, as somebody probably very similar to me, I wasn't born in this country. I came from immigrant parents who instilled in me that the only way to give back to the country that has basically allowed us to come is to work hard and to get a career. And my father used to also tell me, you have to be better than everybody else. I mean, and what he actually meant was that I suspect as a foreign female, I had to be better. So I worked very hard, very, very hard. And I think I've got a slightly hyperactive mind, which means I was never satisfied with just doing one thing. I was always looking to do more and more and more, which means that you tend to do a lot, and a lot of the things I did worked out well. So you then do more and more. So, and the more you do, the more responsibilities, and the more you have to carry that responsibility. So I think it's probably come originally from a sense of not feeling that I was as good as everybody else, and therefore having to work and to prove myself.
I mean, you're sort of up there at the sort of top of the rung. Do you still have that sense that, oh my God, there are other people who are sort of up there, and I've got to keep climbing?
What I'm finding now is this fabulous position of where mainly younger people are approaching me with their ideas and wanting my help, which I give them. And I am just awestruck by this group that's out there that I never knew about. And I don't want to be them. So it's not like I want to be them and compete against them, but I just want to help them. And it's trying. So this has recently changed in terms of my ambition. I'm no longer ambitious in terms of wanting to do more, though I'm certainly not giving up anything, but it's about exploring areas with others that I would never have thought about. For example, tech, and particular femtech, women's technology, and either women leading technology or technology addressing women's problems. I would never have expected that would be of interest to me a year ago. And now I'm finding myself increasingly talking to people in that space and increasingly being excited about it, but not as somebody that wants to lead it, because I can't lead it. I'm not experienced enough. I'm too old to learn those new skills, but supporting the next generation in order to lead themselves. So that's what I'm excited about at the moment. So
in a sense, something's changing you where you're sort of taking a back seat and sort of enjoying the scenery.
Yeah, I'm not quite enjoying the scenery. I'm not quite Haidar. I'm still, my diary is completely full. I also run a gambling service, a primary care gambling service, breaking the mold in terms of how gambling addiction services should be run, forming an intermediate service, which is where I think the health service has never moved on. So an intermediate generalist-led service that supports GPs, supports the voluntary sector, supports the secondary care service, and sees patients who really can be managed within a multidisciplinary generalist format. I also chair a charity, Doctors in Distress, aiming to reduce the rate of suicide amongst all health professionals. So I'm kept very busy in the things that I do.
I mean, do they sort of come together, the gambling issue and also, the mental health and suicide issue, or are they two sort of separate things?
No, they're two completely separate things.
Yeah.
The first time in my life, there isn't an overlap. This is gambling issues for the general patient population. Doctors in Distress is for health service practitioners, all health service practitioners. But the gambling comes out of an interest that I've had with addiction that goes way back. In fact, I started my career caring for intravenous drug users, homeless intravenous drug users, and set up a model of care through my practice that was then adopted around shared care. So I've just replicated it with gambling, and it works. But it's interesting that I have got into gambling because I'd never have thought of getting into addiction again, and certainly not behavioral addictions. But it's a wonderful space to be. Wonderful isn't not for the people who've got a gambling addiction, but it's wonderful in terms of being able to help people, able to find solutions, to be responsive, to support GPs because it's easily referable. They can just tell people to go on the website, the primary care gambling service, or just drop us an email through the website. And we're beginning to show proof of concept that if we provide an easily accessible service, patients will come to us and we get them better.
What are the biggest barriers and sort of roadblocks
for patients? Actually, it's deep shame. More so, I think, than, oddly enough, than the drug users I used to manage. Because gambling is so pervasive, it's a bit like drinking alcohol. Most people drink alcohol, and most people will have a flutter of some kind or other. They may just buy a lottery ticket, or they may play bingo once a month. So the fact that some people then become addicted is so shameful, because they think, well, actually, why can't I be like everybody else? Why can't I just enjoy the odd bet? Because there's nothing wrong with betting or having a gamble. What's the problem is when it trips into being a pervasive issue in your life, and you're spending too much money or too much time, or when it's causing harm to yourself. But these people, unlike, as I said, intravenous drug users, where de facto you're doing something which most people don't do, they feel so shameful that this so-called normal activity is causing them serious problems. So it's actually getting over that line. There's also the shame in some of the groups that we care for, women, using especially in times like now, is the cost of living rising, using money that should be spent on caring for your family on actually an addiction, again, is deeply shaming. And instead of putting your hand up and saying, please help, what tends to happen is people further entrench themselves and do it secretively. So anybody listening to this, if you've got patients who are problems with gambling, primary care gambling service, just go online and have a little look.
Yeah. I mean, is there a sort of a pressure from society as well that there should be, less talked about and not looked into, or is it more of a personal?
Well, it's society
dynamic?
Because it's so normalized. If you think about it, I mean, even on the front of buses, the side of buses, adverts for spread betting, adverts on every time you watch a sports program, adverts during the pandemic, during lockdown. Many, I admit, deeply embarrassingly, occasionally watch daytime TV between Zoom meetings. The adverts predominantly during daytime TV are directed at women, and many of them are around gambling. They may not look like they are, but they are. So bingo, for example. So it's so normalized that actually to admit you have a problem is very, very difficult. The same goes with other behavioral addictions like eating. I mean, like obesity, it becomes, the fact that everybody is doing it makes it harder for you to put your hand up and say, I've got a problem.
Yeah, and there must be a reason why it's sort of women per se, or is that because, you're more sort of inclined to look towards that area of society?
Women probably don't have a higher rate of gambling problems than men, but what they have is more secrecy. But that goes for all sorts of issues with women, that there is this fallen angel syndrome where women tend to be looked upon far more harshly than male counterparts. So I remember, for example, when I was really involved in caring for intravenous drug users, that a woman user caught dealing, for example, would get one of two penalties. Either she would sort of get a very lenient one, or she'd be sent to jail, whereas a male counterpart tended to have more of a normal distribution of the penalties. And I read I did some work to find out why this was the case, and there is this concept called the fallen angel. So women should not transgress, or should not, in inverted commas, and when they do, they were punished harshly. Now you see this played out all over the place. You see it played out, for example, even in women chief executives who maybe their trusts fail, they are pilloried. You see it played out in politics for female senior politicians. You see it played out with all sorts of areas where females may make a mistake or transgress. We are treated in a different way to our male counterparts. It's either all or nothing. So, and going back to the social media discussion, I think there is a gender issue there, and it's to do with, I suspect it's to do with the fact that women are our mothers. The first relationship you have is with your mother. The idea that a mother can do something bad or perceived to do something bad is too painful to think about. So I think it's all caught up in that.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously complicated. There's sort of the positive and negative in both the feminine and the masculine. Maybe it's easier to sort of talk about the masculine, and it's a bit more taboo to talk about the feminine and the mother figure, whether it's the all-wise mother and the devouring mother. So
You're right, or the nurturing mother. I mean, again, the mother doesn't always have to be resided in the woman, by the way. I mean, there's mothering, but if we take it about as the concept, as I'm talking about, the mother tends to be the container effect of the woman, the container to make you safe, to keep you safe, and with that comes all sorts of assumptions and, conscious and unconscious. So it's a complicated way of saying that it's harder for women to admit when things go wrong, and they tend to be treated differently in this very bimodal way, all or nothing, whereas men tend to get a much more even distribution. And whilst men struggle also to especially admit alcohol dependence, it's not as shaming as it is for a woman.
So you were born in Nigeria.
Yes.
Do you remember sort of that earlier part in your life?
No, not really. We came to England when I was nearly 4. I have fleeting memories of Nigeria, but not really. It was always part of me. Born in Nigeria, of Maltese parents living in England, was my identity, that I didn't belong anywhere. Born on one continent, living in another. A double immigrant, so an immigrant to Nigeria essentially, and then an immigrant to this country. So it was just always part of me. This person that just didn't fit in. People couldn't pigeonhole, which again has carried me through my entire life. That people have assumptions about me, which are so unfounded. But I think it's because they struggle to fit me in. They struggle to pigeonhole me. I'm nothing and everything.
Yeah. And when was the first time did you kind of sort of settle into something and say to yourself, "Oh, I found my place here"?
It's a very good question. I was Maltese by nationality till I was 18, and I went traveling when I was 18 around the world, just between at the end of school, and I couldn't get into certain countries because I had a Maltese passport, and so I came home and changed it to a British passport. So at the age of 19 I became British, and it was very strange. And you weren't allowed dual nationality then, but post-Brexit I got back my Maltese nationality. So I'm now British and Maltese, and I feel both. But the only place I ever go, that nobody says, "Where do you come from?" is Malta. So it is. So I still don't feel I found my true identity. I clearly am British. I love this country. But when I go into Malta, I feel I belong. But equally, first time I ever went back to Africa, and I looked up at the sky, I felt this recognition, and it must be, I mean, those of you will think I'm mad, but it must be a deeply, deeply unconscious recognition of the sky being familiar. And it must have been, I think, a childhood memory of when you're lying in your cot looking up at the African sky, because there is nothing like the African sky. So I don't really belong anywhere, but I think a lot of immigrants feel that, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, I have a similar kind of feeling when I go back home to Iraq. It's yes, this is me, this is my roots, I sort of belong here. And then my kind of cultural indoctrination comes in and says, no, you like fish and chips, and you like watching EastEnders, but that's more of a cognitive and sort of rational process. But more of a deep unconscious feeling tends to be sort of Iraq roots.
Well, I also know that my great grandmother came from Egypt. So, and therefore I also know that my real roots are not, of course, in Malta. I mean, Malta is just a little island that people accidentally stopped off. So I feel more now, as I'm growing older, more Arabic than I do European, which is very odd. And Maltese, of course, is an Arabic language. Malta is closer to the Arabs, or was closer to the Arabic states than it was to the Mediterranean. Now it's closer to Italy and whatever. But I struggle when I have to fill in those ethnicity forms. I struggle because I am not white British. And so I now tick, oddly enough, Arab other.
Oh, wow.
Because I think it most closely defines what I feel inside, which is this Arab other ethnicity.
Well, the Arab nationals would very much like that comment from you.
Yes. But I feel more, but it's when you're forced to identify, you struggle, don't you? And you really pushed to say, what am I? I would tick Mediterranean, but there isn't an ethnic origin that is Mediterranean.
Oh, really?
But no, there's none. So, but it's very odd. So there you are.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, my ancestry go back to Persia. So,
yes.
I mean, I feel that I'm more Persian than Arab. And, I mean, logically speaking, the older the culture, the more likely you are to have taken up those cultural norms
yes.
and, ways of living. So it's interesting. And, eventually we all end up in Africa and that's
yes.
that.
Absolutely. So our DNA is
we can't go beyond that, really.
No.
So I mean, your father was in Peterborough. What was that like, back
Peterborough?
in the
we pronounce it Peterborough. If you come truly from Peterborough, you have
well, I spent some time in Nottingham. My dad
yes.
did his PhD in Nottingham, and we did used to go to Peterborough a few times, and it's a nice part of the world, quite nice.
You flatter it. I'm sure I'll get some vitriol from this, but I'm not sure it is a nice part of the world. Really? It's very, 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 very flat.
Yeah.
It's very windy. Peterborough used to have a population of 80,000 when I grew up there. I think it's now creeping up for 1 million if you count. So it's encroached. Wow. It took the London overspill and expanded. And it has a beautiful cathedral, and it's close to reasonably close to the Norfolk Broads. But forgive me if people are listening to this, but I'm not sure East Anglia is the nicest of all the British counties. Nottingham might be, Nottinghamshire, but what was it like growing up? And my father went there because he spoke Italian, oddly enough, because there was the brickworks, and the brickworks attracted a lot of Italians who came from southern Italy who were experts at making bricks. So it had the largest community of Italians in the UK, and there was no doctor to look after them that spoke Italian mainly for their families, their wives, because of course the men picked up English very quickly, but the wives tend to stay at home, and the grandma and grandpa tend to not to speak English either. So Dad was looking for a job, and somebody said, well, why don't you go to Peterborough because you speak fluent Italian? So he went to Peterborough and he cared for these Italians. And I mean, again, my earliest memories, or some of it, was going before anybody had Italian shops. Now we take it for granted, going into these shops and seeing these produce of salamis and panettone and cheese and wine. And this was nothing like wherever the rest of the shops in Peterborough. And it was wonderful. And they used to give us a lot of presents. We had these food, and I loved it. And a lot of my friends were Italian then. And so there you are, we settled in Peterborough. But I did leave when I was 18 and never returned. So I clearly didn't like it that much to stay.
And did you decide to become a doctor sort of early on, seeing your father, doing the work and helping the community and reaping the rewards with lots of Italian
panettone?
goodies?
Yes, lots of panettone. Yes, of course. I mean, his first surgery was the front room of our house. So if you can imagine the front room where did we have a television? We must have had a television. That was the waiting room for the patients, and the dining room was his consulting room. So we always used to have to be very quiet on a Saturday, because the rest of the days we were at school, because the patients would be there, and the patients would be in the car park there. Nobody had cars in those days. So, and the house had all the trappings of medicine. So it had his skeleton, so I used to play with the skeleton, and it had, I mean, awful to think about it, but it had the specular and the tongue depressors, which I used to draw on and make as little puppets. So, you know, that was my life. And he used to take me on home visits, and I used to sit outside in the car waiting eagerly for him to come out and tell me what happened inside. And so he inspired me to be a doctor. I was never going to be anything else ever. Well, once I decided I was going to be a biochemist, but I don't know why. I think I liked the biochemistry teacher or the chemistry teacher, but I was always going to do medicine.
And was it because you went into psychiatry before general practice? Was that because you didn't want to become a GP, or what was?
I didn't want to take over my dad's practice. If the truth be known, the pressure was on. By this time, he'd expanded. He was running 3 or 4 practices across Peterborough, and there was an unspoken expectation that I would return. And though it wasn't fully formulated in my head, I wasn't ready to go back to Peterborough. And I then did a surgical house job, and in the spaces between working, because you could have spaces then, I would go into the library and I'd sit on the floor and read these green journal, which must have been the British Journal of Psychiatry, I don't know, but I used to read about Freud. So I decided I wanted to do psychiatry because I wanted to learn about Freud, as one does. So I applied for the Maudsley, which is the most anti-psychotherapeutic training institution you could ever have, telling them I wanted to learn about Freud and not schizophrenia. But actually they offered me a rotation there, and I never looked back. But I loved general practice. I loved the generalist. Every job I did, I enjoyed, whether it was care of the elderly, right through to child psychiatry or forensic psychiatry. So I just thought, listen, I'm a generalist. So I left and did the training for general practice, and have never looked back, really.
Yeah, I mean, you know, studying Freud is great because it's all sex and sort of mother problems and father sexual it's great. It's great to read that stuff.
It was great, but it didn't teach me anything. I mean, I was more, oddly enough, I was interested in him as a person, and I still am interested in him as a person, and still read a lot about Freud, and less about his analytical his analytical theories, more about how he came to these analytical theories, and how what we now have in psychoanalysis, he actually, you know, he basically had relationships with his patients. He had very few boundaries. And so that's the bit that I'm interested around Freud, though I'm interested in the analytical theories as well.
Yeah, but you know, it's sort of very colorful physicians for sure. You know, there were great characters, and they used to experiment a lot, which was really fun to read about. It's a bit difficult experimenting now, you know, in this sort of day and age of even Twitter doesn't let us experiment much.
No, but we have to get back to that. I think we have to experiment, but in the end, I've combined psychiatry and general practice totally and utterly throughout my career.
Oh yeah. I mean, I'm biased, but you know, I think the psychological component of disease is big.
And the psychological component of what I mean, Freud wrote a lot about crowds, and he didn't quite write about the group mind, but there's concepts of it, and you see that in Twitter. You see the group mind in Twitter. You see the fact that people believe the same thing, and if you are an outlier, how much you suffer. And I've used Freud's interpretations in not just my clinical work, but in my leadership work, because you also see it in identification of the scapegoat, for example. Why do people choose a scapegoat? What do people in a group, in a team, what role do they play for each other? What role do they play in the team? And through Freud, well, not because of Freud, but I started a group analytical training. I was introduced to other great thinkers mainly around groups, so Bion, and that I've taken into my leadership work, and seeing how boards work. And if you ever want to read anything, read Beyond's Basic Assumptions, and it explain everything about dysfunctional groups and dysfunctional boards.
And just wanted to ask you about, you seem to be interested in the people at the bottom of society, so to speak, at the lowest rung.
Yes. Well,
where did that interest come from?
I mean, some of it's serendipity. I started my career, really started it in 1986. And if one thinks about 1986, we were just starting in the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And it was moving from men who have sex with men to intravenous drug users. And nobody wanted to touch these people, literally and metaphorically. And I did. I mean, it wasn't that I was a special person. I just did. These were people my age, more or less, dying. And I was doing addiction at the time, and I set up a barefoot service in a street needle exchange unit. And it was just what I needed to do. And ever since then, there has been a need. I mean, there's been a need. I don't know where the need comes from. So but I have looked after some of the most disadvantaged people, the homeless, drug users. I ran a service for pregnant drug users, pregnant intravenous drug users, and they're mentally ill doctors, now gamblers. If you ask where did it come from, again, I think it's because people try and pigeonhole me, but I'm not pigeonholed. I grew up in an outwardly very affluent household, but when my parents separated and later divorced, there was no money at all. I mean, for various reasons which I don't want to go into. So here was this outwardly wealthy doctor's daughter living as I did with my mother, where there wasn't money. There wasn't money for clothes. Sometimes there wasn't money for food. I came from a very large family, but was more or less brought up as a singleton because of the split. And so, and then there's various other things around the makeup of my family, my siblings. So it means you become self-sufficient. You look out for others because you realize that you have to look out for others because that's what you
found purpose and meaning in that way of living, essentially.
Yes.
That's what sort of gave you the sparkle in yourself and in your eyes and in your being.
Yes, so to speak. So, and it's interesting. I mean, look, drug users get better. There is nothing more satisfying than looking after an intravenous drug user. So they'd come in literally off the street, disheveled, abscesses, sometimes clucking, withdrawing, their life all over the place, the relationship in tatters. And within 2 weeks, you'd be able to transform them. And they're not better, it's a lifelong of transformation, but you tell me anything else that you can have that major impact as a GP. It was staggering and I loved it.
Wow, yeah. I mean, we get a similar thing when we take out cataracts, which is really well,
you do with surgical procedures, absolutely. But with this, you see, with drug users, every part of their life is being destroyed, and you can fix it by being kind, giving appropriate treatment, and by helping and just being there. And you know what? I still get an email every year from this wonderful patient who's an alcoholic and a drug user. Every year he sends me an email telling me his progress and explaining how this help that I gave him has allowed him to progress. And that's the joy.
Yeah. And I know you're very busy, and I don't want to take too much of your time, so hopefully we can wrap this up soon. I mean, GPs are having a really hard time at the moment. I mean, that's the kind of impression that I get from the papers and from social media.
Well, I mean, that time we're seen both as the scapegoat and the saviour of the NHS. The only group that is basically personally identified. So it's GPs not doing this, whereas if something, waiting lists in A&E, they don't say A&E consultants not doing this. We have a system of healthcare in the UK that is built on the wrong premise, which is heavy loading in terms of funding and resources at the hospital end, and minuscule in comparison in the GP end, yet GPs do. So there's about 130 different specialties and subspecialties in medicine. We call it medicine in, the capital M. So about 130, whereas there's only one general practice specialty. So all of those 130 demand us to do work essentially for them, and we just can't do it. And yet within general practice, we also have the breadth of our interaction. So we go from people like myself managing mental illness, care of the homeless, but right through to GPs doing urgent care, IT. And so yet we're seen as just one entity. We have only 8% of the NHS budget for a vast amount of the work. And even if we were to double our budget now, double our allocation, we would still only be where we were in around 2006. So that demonstrates. And yet at the same time, everybody demands more and more from us. So unless the system sorts itself out, I really am fearful for my profession. And the system is the system. We have to move hospital doctors out of hospitals. We have to address why we have outpatient departments. We have to create intermediate services, co-locate staff within polyclinics, and call it what they like, big health centres. We have to have standards across the transition, so hospital doctors care for patients not just in hospital but out of hospital. So everything needs to change.
So obviously there's no easy answer to this, but I mean, if you were to have some easy answers or sort of quick fixes.
There are easy answers. There are answers, and some of them are easy. In the elevator speech, it's very difficult because it's about shifting the incentives away from the incentives of volume of activity in hospitals to actually care of the patient for maybe a year of life. It's changing the regulatory processes so that hospital doctors can work within a primary care setting. Now they can, but it's quite complicated in that our contract doesn't allow us to count them as activity if they see our patients. So it's all complex. It's about changing.
And why has that happened? What's the sort of stumbling blocks there?
Oh, the
or is it just
blocks there.
Sort of
stumbling blocks there around.
Yeah.
Well, no, it's around the performance list. It's not historical, because when I started out in hospital medicine, hospital doctors could work in general practice. So it's not historical. It's changed. It's around changing the regulatory processes, the funding processes. So it can be done tomorrow, where there's a will. And so if a trust, for example, wanted to set up an intermediate service for complex frailty. Now some have, but say for complex frailty, you could do it tomorrow. Once you then start to say, these are our patients within a local community, that belong to all of us, including the local authority, forget about how we move the money for the moment, but just say, how do we deliver care for frailty? Do we take, for example, the top 600 frail patients within a local area and provide them with an intermediate service with GP, dietitian, etc., and use the hospital system for those that need inpatient care, and use the GP for some of the additional services that are needed. But so it can be done tomorrow. What isn't a problem now, what is a problem is you have a patient who is discharged from hospital. The tortuous nature of me getting that help if I need it, even somebody with, let's say, rheumatoid arthritis, for argument's sake, new diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis, that patient is discharged to me as the GP and only seen by the hospital if I then re-refer the patient back, which takes a lot of time and effort. We shouldn't be doing that in the 21st century. That newly diagnosed patient with rheumatoid arthritis should belong to an intermediate service that includes the specialist, the generalist, in order to manage that patient. Once they're stable, they can go back to the GP, but at the moment they start to relapse or something needs more complex, they come back to the intermediate service without the need for a referral letter, for all of this nonsense. So the system needs changing fundamentally, but it can happen. It can happen, and some places are changing it.
So locally it's happening, and if they're more successful locally, then it's more likely to be taken up by
it's happened. If you read, people listening to this want to read Teams Without Walls, written in 2008. We had more of the past, more of the future 15 years ago than we have now. So we had intermediate services, we had proper shared care, not shifted care. We had co-located services. We had services that spanned inside and outside hospital. We had intermediate hospitals, low threshold hospitals where you could admit people for a day or 2 days just because they were off their feet. So we had all of this. We've just taken our eye off it and built up such divisions between primary and secondary care. And again, on Twitter, people say, I don't like doctors. It's hospital doctors. Nonsense. It's the system that needs to change. We have a system that was set up after the Great Plague, and it hasn't really changed since.
I mean, I'd like to finish on a positive. Could we sort of finish on that, and could you give us some positives about?
Well, it's all positive, really. I mean, what I've been talking about is positive. There are real changes happening in the system now. There's a real commitment to change, mainly because we're entering, austerity and no further funding, or presumably not much more funding for the NHS. So we are seeing, and the good people who work in the system, hospital doctors, GPs, hospital nurses, community managers, want to find a way through this. So it is positive. It's very, very positive. We also have a commitment to address the well-being of staff, and we have a commitment to look at reducing inequalities. So I am positive, very, very positive for the future.
So, I mean, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. There's lots of hard work in front of us, but the resolve is there and the energy is there. And
yes, absolutely.
The brain power is there as well.
Fabulous. Well, thank you. Thank you for
Thank you. No,
me.
I mean, thank you so much. I know